Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Very Secret Sex Lives of Medieval Women, an inside look at women and sex in medieval times, by Rosalie Gilbert, narrated by Gould. Disclaimer. This work of literature contains many herbal recipes, preparations and advice from medieval manuscripts which you are ill-advised to attempt at home. Seriously, don't try them. The harm that ensues may be life-threatening and permanent. Death may come to you on swift wings. I repeat, do not try these at home. Except if you're trying to lure a unicorn with your virginity. If you're doing that, feel free to keep up the good work. Introduction. Getting Sexy, Medieval Style. We know that medieval women had sex. We know this, it's a fact. Babies were born. They grew up and had babies of their own, and, in order for that to happen, the act of procreation must have occurred. This much we do know. But have you ever wondered what sex was like for the medieval woman? Were women slaves to their husband's every desire? Were they secured safely and jealously in a chastity belt in his absence? Was sex a duty, or could it be a pleasure? Did the medieval woman have any say about her own body, and who did or didn't get up close and personal with it at all? Ever? About any of it? So much more than you might think. In the modern world, we have the Victorian scholars to thank for many of the grossly misleading ideas about the women who came before us in the medieval world. Many of the so-called facts that we think we know today can be directly attributed to them. The Victorian era was full of smug people who were quite delighted with their own society and how clever it was, and concluded loudly in literature everywhere what an awful, backwoods, uncultured and uncivilized society everyone before their own had been. This flew in the face of historical evidence of Romans, Etruscans and the Spanish Inquisition. Okay, the Inquisition was uncivilized in the respect that religious mania persecuted humans in brutal and horrendous ways, but the religious and domestic arts and science of the time period were not. Unfortunately, no one questioned any of these Victorian ideas because, wait for it, contemporary Victorians also agreed. There was no kind of peer review process where an inquiring scholar might challenge a history authority or meekly inquire whether things were being blown out of proportion a little and looking into it properly might be a good idea. No, they had ideas about medieval people and they stuck to them. The biggest problem with this is, as Hollywood found its feet and blossomed into a thriving industry, producers read a lot of books and then just ran with what they found there. They cherry-picked their favourite bits. Costumes, customs, and depictions of historical life were gleefully snatched from the pages of Victorian writers, and suddenly, what the world knew to be true about past lives was their interpretation of it. Vikings gained horned helmets. Viking women got those coconut-shaped breast covers. Pointy princess hats called hennons, which were popular for a very, very short time, became the must-have item for every medieval woman, regardless of what else she was wearing. Fur rugs were draped over absolutely everything, and castle walls were unpainted stones. Peasants were dressed in clothing which was poorly sewn and ill-fitting, and everyone wore brown. Even the black, rotting teeth we see in movies is inaccurate, not coming until the widespread use of sugar, and is not indicative of general hygiene standards in the Middle Ages. Likewise, medieval women suffered at the hands of the Victorian imaginings. Women couldn't read, they had no say about anything and couldn't own property or run businesses. They didn't wear makeup or underpants, and chastity belts were insisted upon. It was really quite unfair. In fact, medieval women had tweezers and shaped their eyebrows. They cared about their appearance. Poor women had very little, but because they had little, it was made to last and was less disposable than our cheap chain store clothing of today. Hinting that clothing which was hand-spun and hand-woven was also poorly made is insulting and incorrect. A woman who had learned to sew from a very early age was extremely good at it by the time she was required to produce clothing for her family. The intimate lives of medieval women were as complex and as complicated as ours today, with very little being clear-cut, and many of the issues relating to sexual relationships having distinctly blurry edges. Women then, as now, loved and lost, hoped and schemed, laughed and cried, were lifted up and cast down. They were hopeful and lovelorn. Some were chaste and some were lusty. Some had sex thrust unwillingly upon them and had to deal with the consequences. Others made aphrodisiacs and dressed for success. Sometimes having sex was complicated. Sometimes not having sex was even more so. In spite of the hundreds of years which separate the very secret sex lives of medieval women and the sex lives of modern women, many similarities remain. Only the actual women have changed. These are true stories of over 100 actual medieval women. Let's go and meet them now. Chapter 1. How to know if you're having it. Unlike today, a medieval woman's status in society wasn't gauged by her age or by her level of education, profession, or her career successes, but by her sexual status. She was either a virgin, young, unmarried, not allowed to have sex, a wife, married, allowed to have sex, a widow, ex-married, not allowed to have sex, a strumpet, single, having or suspected of having sex. And her rights and obligations in society were hugely dependent on this. An unmarried woman, generally speaking, was a dependent in her father's household and was pretty much nothing more than a marriageable commodity who was to enrich someone else's family in the future. She might have some education and skills, but, on the whole, she was seen as not having found her place in society just yet. A married woman was accorded respect as a wife and mother, manager of a household, and a person who might also work in her husband's business. She might have a trade. She was the wife of somebody, and everything she did, good or bad, reflected on him. If a woman wasn't either of those things, she had special circumstances attached to her, or she was walking a fine line which was leading to certain doom. Married women who were not faithful to their husbands were liable to find themselves in a situation ending badly, as adultery was a serious crime. There was a fine line between courtly love and just getting a bit on the side. Virgins. As far as sex is concerned, if you're young and single, you're undoubtedly a virgin and you're not having sex. At all. Your haystack is unrolled, your rose garden is unwalked in, and your ring is unspeared. Virgins were not only a valuable commodity, their very purity could, according to legend, lure unicorns. Even if actual unicorns were mythical, it can be said that virgins did attract a number of beasts who had a horn where their brain should be. There were two types of virgins in medieval society. Both guarded their virginity fiercely, but for very different reasons. Virgins by circumstance. These were usually girls and young women who were not yet wed and who, in the fullness of time, would become wives and mothers. Their chastity was critical if they were to make good and often financially profitable marriages. The higher the class of the girl, the less likely she be left unchaperoned, and the more likely that her future husband and sex partner was to be determined for her. We know that many a young bride-to-be viewed this arrangement with trepidation, and who could blame her? A young lady who was marrying someone socially important might have her virginity verified by female doctors or religious women before her nuptials proceeded to the signing of the goods and chattels stage, but this was absolutely not the usual thing for everyday women. Failure to pass this test guaranteed shame and scandal in the family and the broader community. Penalties for raping a virgin were extremely severe, as a good marriage afterwards was next to impossible. It simply wouldn't do. Saint Agnes of Rome. Virgins in a perilous world needed special protection, and Saint Agnes was the go-to saint for virgins of any age. She was known under a few different names: Agnes of Rome, Inés, and Inés del Campo, but is usually easy to identify as she is almost always shown with her signature lamb. Although Agnus is the Latin word for lamb, Agnes is a Greek word meaning pure, chaste, and sacred. Saint Agnes was born in 291 AD in Rome. For her age, she had rather strong feelings about Christianity and resisted all efforts and bribes to get her to change her mind. Agnes had never wished to marry at all, citing Jesus as her only spouse, even as a preteen. There are conflicting accounts of her martyrdom, but most agree that she was around 12 or 13 when she refused a betrothal to a Roman official's son and was decapitated on January 21, 304 AD. Her skull is housed today for visiting pilgrims in a side chapel of the Church of St. Agnes in Agony in Piazza Navona, Rome. It is a monument to those who pray to keep their virginity, which is the exact opposite of the point her parents were trying to make. The biggest problem with being a virgin in medieval society is that men absolutely wanted to have sex with you with little regard for your age, your occupation, or whether or not you'd made a vow to God to remain so. One of the stories in the Chronicles of the Congregation of the Apostles in Parma illustrates this clearly. The Widow's Daughter of Parma. It was the early 13th century when a widow's daughter had the misfortune to be home when some itinerant monks came calling. Gherardino Segarelli had great plans to be a holy man and is recorded to have stayed overnight at a certain widow's house for shelter. He noted that she had a virgin daughter and said that God had spoken to him, commanding him to test his chastity by laying naked with the daughter for the night. The mother was not convinced in the least, but Gherardino was not thwarted and quoted Bible verses at her from the Gospel of St. Matthew, stating that men may make themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of God, and that her daughter was in no danger of losing her virginity. She believed him. He lied. Virgins by choice. The second kind of virgin was the virgin by choice. These adult women had consciously made the decision to remain chaste, usually paired with a commitment to God to continue to do so for the foreseeable future. In some cases, this was seen to be admirable, but in other cases, not so much. Christina of Markyate was one of the latter. Theodora of Huntingdon, a.k.a. Christina of Markyate. Christina was an Anglo-Saxon born in Huntingdon, England, around 1096 to 1098. Her birth name was Theodora. Her parents, Beatrix and Auti, were wealthy merchants and not more religious, especially, than others in their town. As a little girl, Theodora talked to Christ as if he were a real person she could see. When she became a teen, she visited St. Albans Abbey in Hertfordshire, where she was so overcome with devoutness that she took a secret vow of chastity right then and there. At some point, Theodora was visiting her aunt when a visiting bishop got the hots for her and tried to make her his lover. Being a smart girl, Theodora helpfully suggested that she lock the door to guarantee their privacy. The bishop agreed, but she locked him inside the room without her. Needless to say, this did not go down well. Angry at being spurned, the bishop arranged a marriage for Theodora with a nobleman named Bjortrid. Theodora's parents agreed to the match, but Theodora refused. Her parents were furious. They tried all the usual things, bewitching her, getting her drunk, pulling her hair, beatings and threats, but none made any great impression, and Theodora stuck to her guns. In a desperate effort to make the marriage happen, her parents arranged that Bjortrid would have access to her bedroom so that he might enter at night and rape her, thus forcing the marriage. Things took a disappointing turn for the worse from there. The next morning, when Theodora's parents came to the room to check how things were moving along, they were aghast to find that Theodora had spent the night telling the disappointed man stories about chaste marriages and other virtuous women. Unsurprisingly, Bjortrid's friends mocked him mercilessly for failing to get the girl. Not to be deterred, her parents let the determined groom-to-be into her room a second time and hoped for better results. Apparently, Theodora hid behind a tapestry and Bjortrid couldn't find her, which tells us a little about the kind of guy he was and hints that he was not as determined as he first seemed. Eventually, Theodora escaped, disguised in men's clothing, and was secreted away with an anchoress at Flamstead. It was here that she changed her name to Christina and devoted the rest of her life to chastity and worship, becoming the head of a community of nuns. She died a virgin in about 1155. Christina 1, parents 0. Christina wasn't the only one to take advantage of the shelter that religious houses offered. The best news of all is that those women who wished to live chaste lives in the name of holiness could be married and still enjoy all the perks of being socially elevated as wives. A nun could also avoid getting naked with a husband who didn't rev her engine. Whilst a vow of chastity was deemed fairly admirable by the general community at large, it could also be quite unfortunate for an eager husband who discovered that his brand-new bride fancied God far more than a romantic interlude with himself. This was particularly unfortunate because should a husband take his complaint to his priest, he could expect nothing but congratulations for having such an outstandingly pious woman in his life. Congratulations, indeed. It was a rather nice loophole for the reluctant wife who had found herself the product of a convenient family union for the purposes of expanding the family estates or an upwardly mobile social connection. There are not many written records of women who married and remained chaste throughout their entire marriages, but there are a few. These women maintained their virginity despite their disappointed husbands' best efforts. I imagine it generally went down something a little like this. Geoffrey is a balding, fat, somewhat rich 50-year-old and has scored for himself a cute 17-year-old bride. The documents have been signed, ceremony performed, dowry delivered, crowd waiting around the marital bed to verify that intercourse had indeed taken place, and all that remains is to bed his bride. Margaret, however, seems quite pensive about the whole situation and is looking for a way out. Margaret, my husband, before we retire to bed, I must pray and give thanks to God for this day. Geoffrey, oh, sure, if you must, my wife, but do hurry, we have some consummating to do. Margaret, won't be long. 10 minutes later. Geoffrey, how's it going? You done praying yet? I'm, waiting. Margaret, my husband, rejoice. I was praying so hard and, why, it's quite miraculous. The Lord spake to me verily, and bid me love only him with my heart and soul, and especially my body, and I know you'll be so happy, but I'm overcome with love for our God, and I'm taking a vow of chastity right here and now because of my sudden love for him, and I hereby release you from your marriage debt. Hallelujah! Aren't you so pleased? Geoffrey: That's great, Marge. Wait, what? Best loophole ever. Faking it. If a young woman had been careless with her virginity and her marriage day was drawing near, all was not lost. Methods to make a woman seem like a virgin all over again were available if one knew who to ask. Here we meet a rather remarkable woman by the name of Trotula. She had a lot of great advice about a lot of great things. No, seriously, it's great. Trotula de Ruggiero. Trotula de Ruggiero was a female medic from the 11th century who is widely credited for, if not writing, then at the very least compiling the medical health treatise specifically aimed at women, their gynecological complaints, and other issues which a woman may feel awkward discussing with a man. It was called De Passionibus Mulierum Curanderum, or in English, About Women's Diseases. Many remedies are for the relief of complaints rather than actual diseases, but her work was used for an extended period of time and her advice taken in all seriousness, even the really weird bits. Restricting it. When it came to faking virginity, Trotula was an ideas woman. She had 2 foolproof ways to trick a husband into thinking he'd married a virgin when, in fact, he hadn't. The first method was to constrict the vagina so it appeared untouched. She had several ripping recipes to try. I strongly suggest you try exactly none of them at home. Firstly, this one required an extended amount of dedicated administering and quite a bit of spare linen. A constrictive for the vagina so that they may appear as if they were virgins. Take the whites of eggs and mix them with water in which pennyroyal and hot herbs of this kind have been cooked, and with a new linen cloth dipped in it, place it in the vagina 2 or 3 times a day. And if she urinates at night, put it in again. And note that prior to this, the vagina ought to be washed well with the same warm water with which these things are mixed. Well, that's almost helpful, except for the bit about herbs of this kind. That's way too vague. It's almost as if she doesn't want to help at all. A woman who is placing anything into her pink bits or washing them with water steeped in herbs of any kind needs to know exactly what they should be. Guesswork could produce alarming results or be downright fatal. Failure to get a good result could easily be blamed on lack of adequate knowledge of herbology, which doesn't help the bride-to-be in the least. For the woman of simple means, with no one to ask about what kind of specific herbs she needed for the first recipe, Trotula had another nifty DIY, which was more explicit, required very few resources and little preparation, and could be made in a reasonable time frame should the wedding be impending sooner than planned. Likewise, take the powder of natron or blackberry and put it in. It constricts marvellously. Natron is a mineral salt which is found in lake beds. It might be available in a city or town, but not so much in a village nowhere near a lake. Whilst a woman who was low on the socio-economic scale was unlikely to have natron already hanging around the kitchen, she potentially had access to free blackberries growing in the garden. Again, specific recipe directions are lacking, and it's not clear which part of the blackberry is to be powdered. Leaves? Stem? Dried fruit? So many variables. No wonder these things often didn't work. For the woman who needed to appear virginal and who also had access to a variety of exotic materials, another recipe which required far less guesswork but far more financial outlay was this. in another fashion, take oak apples, roses, sumac, great plantain, comfrey, Armenian bole, alum, and fuller's earth, of each 1 ounce, let them be cooked in rainwater, and with this water let the genitals be fomented. If one wasn't restricted adequately, at least the bowl would give the lower lips an attractive rosy glow, the roses would make them smell nice, and the comfrey and the clay of the fuller's earth would be soothing to the potential unpleasantness of the alum. One might just have to fake it after all. Providing a bleed. If restricting the vagina either didn't work or didn't restrict it enough, the second of the Trautula-approved methods could be attempted. Her second method was to provide the bleed, which was expected of a virgin the first time she had intercourse. She advised this should be done by attaching leeches to the bride's labium 1 night before she is to be married. Care was advised not to let the leeches go in too far, but I'm not sure how one goes about that. Put them on a little leash? The blood from the leeches is then converted into a little clot. The man will be deceived by the effusion of blood. This would prove the necessary innocence of his bride, and all would be well. Explaining the jar of leeches the next morning might not be quite so easy. Removal of a wayward leech, even more so. Trautula doesn't mention whether to remove the leeches before coitus, but one assumes so. Having a leech detach from the lady and attach itself onto the penis is likely to raise uncomfortable questions all round. A much more alarming recipe that seems almost guaranteed to provoke bleeding was to make a pomade of ground glass and dye and insert it into the vagina pre-coitus. I feel the dye is completely not needed in this case, as pasting some ground glass into your most vulnerable part seems quite likely to provide all the blood a woman might need. The trick would be getting it to stop. I don't even want to think about what this might do to the unfortunate penis of the husband. Trautula wrote that this was favoured by prostitutes who wishes to appear virginal, but that it was ill-advised. You don't say. The perils of virginhood. Being a virgin was not just as simple as just saying no. The youthful virgin had only to be concerned with whom she was paired up with as a future husband, and whether he was old and unattractive or someone she might come to love. She was usually chaperoned or in the care of an adult as she learned how to manage a household and master domestic tasks. The older virgin had to guard her maidenhead from rape, which could be either an act of random attack, but sometimes was an effort to gain a marriage. Once a woman had been carnally known, chances are the man responsible was liable to marry her. This might secure a reluctant bride who had already turned down an offer of marriage or, in some cases, force parents who felt the prospective groom was unsuitable to agree to a union. It was not entirely unheard of for a woman to stage her abduction and rape with her intended husband. The parents would have no choice but to agree to a marriage under those circumstances once she was spoilt. I am incredibly thankful that neither of these are widespread attitudes we share today. Being ruined or spoilt once one is no longer a virgin is beyond ridiculous. Being forced to marry a man who raped you, even more so. Worse than either of those things was the belief that the older virgin may have urgings. She might become lustful. It was a well-known fact that women were more lustful than men, so this was apparently an actual concern. One could even tell if a woman was longing for sex just by checking out her urine. According to Here Begins the Seeing of Urines, an immensely helpful writing on how urine looks, smells, and tastes, a woman who was feeling amorous could be diagnosed by the kind of urine she was passing at the time. It tells us Urine of a woman coloured as bright gold betokens talent or desirous of the company of men, which is a bit broad, I must say. Talented or
Sample complete. Ready to continue?